So I want to start off by, Tab, I was saying this before, saying thank you guys for being flexible with me. I know I was supposed to come back in December. I got three little kids and they recently made me department chair. And so I'm still figuring out how to combine that with all the other stressors in my life, which means rescheduling things pretty often. So I appreciate you guys working with me on this. And I'm sorry I couldn't join you in person because I'm still hoping to make it out to Dillingham. I've been to Neck Neck and King Salmon a few times and I've driven through Dillingham on my way to Nurka, but didn't get a chance to hang around town yet. So hopefully sometime we'll be visiting you all in the future. The work that I'm going to talk about today is in collaboration with Aaron Enriquez and Steve Newbold. Nothing in this represents the views of the U.S. Geological Survey or the Department of the Interior. Aaron worked on this as a postdoc at UAA on an NSF project that I put together. And Steve's one of our collaborators from the University of Wyoming. I'll also point out really quickly, both these guys are much smarter than I am. So if there are mistakes or other stuff, it's probably something that I'm misexplaining or doing a bad job. They're geniuses. I'm just kind of along for the ride a little bit and doing my best. And I'm also usually not this dressed up. I have to go to a second talk after this. So I realize it's kind of funny to give a fishing talk in a sport coat. But since I'm talking to Alaskans, I think I can be a little bit more straightforward about some of the motivation for why we're interested in this, because I think you guys will get a lot of it, right? And the first part is just the state constitution tells us how we're supposed to manage our resources, that we're supposed to provide for the utilization, development, conservation of our natural resources for the maximum benefit of our people, and fish, forests, wildlife, grasslands, and other resources belonging to the state should be utilized, developed, and maintained on a sustained yield principle subject to preferences among beneficial uses. And so the motivation for this specific project and the question I'm going to talk about today is really that last little line in that second quote, the subject to preferences among beneficial uses. So I don't think I have to convince you guys that fish are pretty cool and that we like them here. I think if anything, you guys maybe are bigger fans of fisheries than I am. But we know that there's a lot of different types of fisheries, right? We've got personal use, we've got subsistence, we've got commercial, we've got various types of commercial fisheries. We've got recreational fisheries that are participated in by residents, by non-residents. And somewhere in this mix, we're supposed to be managing these things according to some subject to preferences amongst all the different uses. And this typically boils down to a preference for subsistence. But that debate is old. It's been going on much longer than I've been here. And I don't know that I have anything particularly interesting to contribute to that discussion. But that's what motivated our question. So our research questions are, if we magically, as economists, got handed basically the preferences of society, so if we knew what those preferences were, how do we allocate between commercial, personal use, and recreational fisheries? And then we said, well, okay, in order to answer that question, we can talk about the value of commercial fisheries as ex-vessel value to fishermen, the first wholesale price to processors, the economic impact of salmon or other fisheries to communities, the jobs created, the value of the lifestyle that people get to live, all that other stuff. And to some extent, we can talk about the economic impact of recreational fisheries in the form of spending in communities, money to guides, tourists that fly up here to take big trips, and even the preferences of recreational fishermen and the way that it makes their lives better if they live in Alaska. And particularly, I'm going to be thinking about an Upper Cook Inlet here. But what we don't have really good numbers for is the value of personal use fishing. And we picked this particular setting because personal use is interesting and unique in that, of course, it plays a different role than recreational fishing. It's how people sort of in the Anchorage, Matsu area, and to some extent the road system will fill their freezers with fish. So it's got some of that value of like more like food production. For some people, it's a bit of a lifestyle. So there's a little bit of a cultural element to it. And it's got some of the recreation and willingness to pay, but it's not really recreational fishing. It's not commercial fishing, and it's certainly not subsistence fishing. But we figured that this can give us an idea of these non-recreational, non-commercial fishing, like its minimum value, basically. And then if we've got those three pieces, if we know roughly what commercial fishing is worth, we know what recreational fishing is, roughly what its impact is, and we have a floor value, like a minimum value for the value of personal use, we can talk a little bit about that, like best allocation between preferential uses. And maybe give a little bit of insight to managers of whether or not they're doing a good job of trying to make those trade-offs between different fisheries. So our data set that I'm going to talk about includes Fish Creek, which is this red dot up and to the right, as well as the Kenai River, which is the red dot in the middle, and the Kasilof River, which is in the bottom left. Um, I don't know how much depth you guys want me to go in Upper Cook Inlet, because I'm for somebody coming from Anchorage, this is where I spend all summer, so that people know, like, I know a lot about it. If I'm giving this talk to people out of state, I might point out Kenai and Kasilof are like 15 minutes apart if you're driving real fast. They're about 3 hours away from Anchorage. Fish Creek is weird for a variety of reasons. It's small, there's access issues, and it's just a different type of fishing. But Kenai and Kasilof are where the bulk of trips go. And to give you a preview of what answers we're going to get from our research, we find that the average Upper Cook Inlet dipnet fishing trip provides about $430 in what's called consumer surplus, or value to a consumer above what it costs to take that trip. So these fishing trips to fill the freezer are valuable to the individual fisherman. They're worth quite a bit. Households from our data are willing to pay about $3.21 to have another 1,000 fish in the water in front of them when they're dip netting. And they're willing to pay $37 for an additional fish caught, which gave us our first cool quote, which is that, at least from our early work that we're still refining, so this is a draft still, a fish in hand is worth about 11,000 times a fish in the water, all things equal. As an aside, since this is more of a brown bag, I'll tell you, I think this is also maybe a sign that people don't have a good idea of how a fish in the water translates to a fish in their net. In general, well, the story to take away from this is that personal use fishermen would prefer larger runs passing in front of them so they can catch more fish. And they really value a fish in net. They're not really sure how much a fish in the water is worth. We also find that households would pay $26 a day, so that's individual households fishing summed up over sometimes several hundred, to shut down the commercial fishery in front of them. And this, I think, is one of the more interesting policy trade-offs that we find in this work, in that there's a really large perceived impact of commercial fishing on the productivity of recreational or of personal use fishing. So people believe the commercial fleet has a big impact on personal use fishing. We actually test that in the data that we have, and we find that it's not every commercial fishery that has an impact. It's the set nets on shore, not the drift net, that seem to impact personal use fishing. So there's also less potentially of a trade-off than one might expect. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But again, this is all sort of in the draft stage. This is just my summary of what salmon fishing in Upper Cook Inlet looks like. We've got fish that come in from the Gulf of Alaska. They pass through a commercial fleet that's both set net and drift net as they go up through the Upper Cook Inlet. Then they pass through our personal use fishermen at the Red Stars, and then eventually they wind up in combat fishing land, where everybody stands in a line and tries to floss sockeye. And so I'm going to be talking pretty much exclusively about sockeye from this point. We are not the big run in Alaska. You guys are, but the salmon sockeye run was about 6.6 million fish in 2024. This was not super out of the norm. A peak day has about 190,000 fish past the weir going up the Kenai River. The commercial fishery catches on average about 2 million fish. About a third of the fish get caught commercially. In 2024, that was worth about $19 million ex vessel value at a price of about $170 per pound ex vessel. 92% of the fish caught are sockeye. There's about 596 permits. The personal use fishery can pull between 130,000 to 540,000 fish in any given year. And then the recreational fishery, we don't know so much about catch, but we do know quite a bit about days fished. So the most recent survey in 2017 had 907,000 days fished. So this is each individual angler fishing on a day is a day of fishing. So a lot of people go fish on the Russian River and the Kenai. There's about $700 million in spending from that fishery. I think one of the other neat policy questions I'm interested in working on in the future is how exactly does a fish in water translate to recreational fishermen? I've done some informal surveying of my colleagues during combat fishing when I asked them if they had caught anything, mostly tourists, and the answer is typically no, because they don't know how to floss and catch fish. But I asked them if they're having fun, and they said yes. And I would ask them if they were coming back, and they would say no, it's a once-in-a-lifetime trip. But it seems like since people are making these travel decisions typically 3 or 4 months in advance, they're not always people who fish a lot. It's not clear to me how much additional fish in the river translates to tourist trips, at least. On the other side, I know every fisherman that I've ever met in Anchorage follows the Facebook groups and knows exactly when the fish are on and where to go. So my rough hypothesis is local fishermen are very responsive to success rates. Out of towners have no idea. personal use, again, looks a little bit like subsistence, but it is absolutely not subsistence fishing. The definition of personal use fishing is that it's for personal use and not for sale, whereas subsistence fishing is non-commercial, customary, and traditional uses for direct personal or family consumption, but it is not personal use, right? It involves typically some cultural aspect, and customary trade, barter, or sharing for personal or family consumption. Under Alaska subsistence statute, the Board of Fish is supposed to identify fish or fisheries that support subsistence fisheries. And if there is a surplus, adopt regulations that provide reasonable opportunities for subsistence. So amongst the beneficial uses, Alaska statute and the Constitution suggest that subsistence fishing gets preferential treatment. It's not so clear that personal use fishing is given that same preference. And so why do people do it? Well, this wouldn't be a good fishing talk if I didn't show pictures of fish that I caught. Right? Typically, folks are going there to fill the freezer. The regs in this particular place are that the head of household gets 25 fish, plus 10 sockeye for each additional household member. This was one cooler run on the Kenai. It took about 30 minutes to catch 2 years ago. It's fun. There's cultural reasons. If you go here, there's a lot of teaching your kids how to fish. This is my colleague in the middle here, Brett Watson, helping my son learn how to dip net. My son had a lot more fun bashing the fish on the head than trying to hold the net, but he's learning, which is pretty cool. And also, the other fun story I like to tell with this paper is on the bottom left behind me, taking that picture where I know I look silly, you can see some smoke. That's a car that caught fire. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that as we go on because it's cool. And also, in addition to other fun fishing stories to tell, this is maybe the largest trailer I've ever seen go into the ocean before, which was pretty exciting. These folks were moving an entire camp out onto the beach on sort of a rough day and blocked the only way in or off the beach. They had this side-by-side. They had a couple four-wheelers trying to pull it out of the way. They were yelling at everybody, and they almost got 3 other trucks washed into the ocean. They managed to get out just at the last minute, but the trailer got pretty wet. So dip netting is an interesting cultural experience because not everybody's very well prepared or thinks through what they're going to do. But it's also got these cultural aspects of people are bringing literally the whole family down for sometimes a week. So there's these non-monetary values that play a big role into it. It's pretty heavily regulated as well. The standard dip netting net is about 5 feet wide. It can't be any wider. It's got to be roughly, at its widest point, it's got to be 5 feet. So it's typically roughly circular. And people take them out. You see big varieties and how long of the pole is it, how long of the pole that's attached to it. And bag limits are pretty strictly enforced. We fish on 1, 2, 3, basically 4 different beaches, all with a single access point. So fishing game is a pretty easy time tracking these things. We have to mark the fish. You will see wildlife troopers every once in a while checking to make sure that fish are marked as they're coming off. We have to report harvest, or you lose the ability to harvest in the future. A lot of this just goes to say that I believe the data that we have on the amount of catch that actually happens. And so the context for our study is pretty neat. Subsistence fisheries have existed in this place since time immemorial. Forever, people have been catching fish here. Commercial fisheries kicked off in the 1880s and boomed during World War II when we needed a cheaper supply of protein. This is also when Bristol Bay, of course, started to take off, right, to feed people in the lower 48. A railroad was set up in the early 1900s, and that led to the first recreational fishery because there was finally access to the place. Over time, the sport fishery took off. It especially jumped in the 1980s when somebody caught a 97-pound king, and that made it into some magazines in the lower 48, and suddenly the Kenai River became the place to go to hunt kings. It's not anymore. It looks like it's closed this year already by emergency order. But dip netting became the sole personal use fishery, sort of as a way to resolve this fight between subsistence fishing and recreational fishing. The state decided to turn it all into subsistence fishing in 1996, and they closed most of the subsistence fisheries. There's a cultural educational fishery there where people are still allowed to do subsistence fishing, but primarily this is the way people are catching to fill their freezer in the area. And managers still face an allocation decision between commercial, recreational, and personal use fishing. Again, about 60% of the catch is commercial, 20% is roughly personal use. The remainder is probably sport fishing. But there's a noted concern, particularly amongst the personal use, subsistence, and recreational fishermen, that the commercial fishermen might catch all the fish. So that's all fun stuff about fishing. On the right-hand side, so this is that car that caught fire. And this was one of the moments, like again, where I just realized I moved up here in 2017 that this is kind of a different animal. You can see all of us kind of turning to our right to watch the Toyota that's on fire. And there was this neat chain of telephone as everybody was telling the person next to them to turn around and see the car on fire on the beach. I did not see a single person get out of the water to go check if it was their car because the fish were hitting at exactly that moment. And the other cool bit was these people had apparently driven up as the fish were hitting and parked on somebody's old campfire. Didn't notice because they were getting their stuff together so quickly and ran into the water. Um, and then, like, everybody around them just moved their trucks and let the car burn. So it's not subsistence, but people take personal use fishing pretty seriously. And so our other motivation for this question is just when we talk about the value of personal use, we talk about these cultural values a little bit. There's a growing literature in economics that's trying to figure out what is the value of culture in place. So there's a study that looked at the Hopi Reservation in the American Southwest. They showed that 76% of households across the United States would pay $5 for every 5 years to provide a pipeline of water to basically allow that reservation to continue to exist. So people were willing to pay the cost to support traditional villages and traditional ways of living. But valuing subsistence in general is super complicated, particularly because in most places we face a mixed market where there's both a market economy and a subsistence economy that are operating at the same time. So it's not clear how people make those trade-offs, which makes it hard for economists to come up with dollar values. Our reason for trying to come up with these values is often things that are not valued or are not priced, are not valued at all. If we don't come up with a number, people often assume it's zero. And so other folks have tried to use compensating wage differentials to figure out what subsistence might be worth. Our approach is to say, what's the absolute minimum value of a fishery that provides similar services but is not subsistence? So every value that I talked about today is also a minimum. So when I talked about that $400 per trip, that is a bare minimum of what a trip that has fill the freezer characteristics is worth. It's not a value of subsistence. The value of subsistence is almost certainly higher, far higher. But we go through and basically look participation in the fishery based on and how it relates to maybe recreation and subsistence activity. And we also are aware of some previous work that looked at the Copper River Basin. They found estimates of the surplus between $17 and $56 in 1999. That's equivalent to $30 to $104 compared to our study. So we are finding higher values than the past literature. They use a different approach that's not as finely detailed. So I would say that our estimates may be better, but not to fight with those folks. And yeah, so let's talk about my data and what we actually did. So we have diary data, which is also really cool, and that we know every day of the season who had a permit, where they went fishing, what they caught, and also when they didn't go fishing. And this is also really unique in the economics literature. Most of the time we have surveys where we're asking people about their most recent trip and maybe how many trips they took. But we don't know all the days they chose not to go. And we know species presence too. Because there are sonar stations within the river, we know how many fish were passing when people made the choice to go fishing or not. And we know that the fishermen know this because all of this is available in real time to fishermen as they're making choices. So this is also super exciting. We've basically got 3 decades of this site choice data in recreational fishing, and we know how many fish are coming by. So this lets us talk about the value of a fish in the water instead of just an additional fish caught. And so as far as our data, we've got individual specific data, and that we know the days and locations fished, their harvest, the species they caught, the size of their household, so how many people they were trying to feed, and their home zip code. From their home zip code, we can use the census to know how far they were driving to get to the different fisheries, the population of those locations, the average income, the average education, and the average age. So we know quite a bit about these people, even though we've had to de-identify the data to make it shareable from ADF and G. We also know the weather at each one of these fishing locations, including the temperature, precipitation, and wind. We know the run size at these different places, and we know if the local commercial fisheries were operating. And we know that because I made my postdoc go through all the management reports and figure out which set net and drift net fisheries were operating on which days for every day for all 3 fisheries for the entire season. And he was super excited to do that, and he loved that opportunity to digitize some data. And I'm hoping to make him do that for another 8 years now that he's at his next job. I'm excited about that. But we also know aggregate data too. So we know how many dip netting permits were fished and how many were returned. and how many people were fishing on any given day. So we got a lot of stuff, and that comes from your average personal use fishing permit. So this is the data as it's reported to ADF&G, right? We've got last name, first name, home address, city, state, zip, phone number, email, driver's license number, sport fishing license number, the names of all their household members, the total number of household people in the household, and everything else. So I would have loved it if ADF&G had just given us this. They pointed out very accurately that that's very identifiable information, and that's typically a problem with social science studies. So we got the permit data, removing last name, removing first name, removing home addresses, removing the city and the state, but we do have zip code, and we've got the number of people in the household. So all the other identifiable stuff has been washed, but we know where people live and how many people are in their households. And we've got this diary data, which is what day did you fish, where did you fish, and what species did you catch. So not bad. We also know that this is enforced. So this is actually when I got in trouble for not reporting. I did report, but the unique thing that I didn't realize is if you fill in the online app, if you fill out a report, and then you don't submit it, but you close it, and you report via the website instead, when you submit for your permit the next year, it will automatically submit all your drafts. And you will get an angry email that you have to appeal telling you that you're not allowed to fish that year. I will also say ADF&G is amazing because I sent one email, explained that I did report, that I'm just dumb, and that I switched and left this draft open. And they said, no worries, you're not the only dumb person who does this every year, and they fixed it. I got to fish that year. So that was really nice of them. And I just want to say thank you, ADF&G, for being really cool about understanding that I'm not good at replying to things or closing out forms. These are some of our aggregate indicators over the season, though. You can see kind of classic salmon run behavior. They don't show up like all at once. They show up, but they show up in kind of these random pulses. You have down days and big days, and different things will drive the run. It'd be nice if they told us how many people or how many fish are going to come at a given time. But the number of participants pretty closely tracks sort of the size of the run, right? So in 2019, we see this pulse around the 20th of July. We see a pulse of people fishing to try and catch them. And we see a pulse of the harvest. It doesn't look like in 2019, people expected the second jump around the end of the month, around the 28th. Fewer people fished. We still saw a jump in catching. One of the first things we did with the data was try and tease out the best days to go fishing. We did pretty well every year after we got the data. But just some summary statistics too. Most people when they're going dip netting go on 1 or 2 day trips. That's over 90% of the sample. Oh, that's frustrating that it shifted. But mostly they also fish on Fridays and Saturdays. Don't worry about that first graph. It wasn't interesting enough for me to close out and try and move things around. As far as our household, the average household size is about 3 people who fishes, which means they have a harvest limit of about 45 fish. They take a total of 1 trip a year, typically. Most people are coming from Anchorage, which is why these travel distances are roughly the same. Their median income is about $85,000 a year for the household. Their median age is about 36, which is a little bit older than average in Alaska. And this is most people who dip net are pretty well educated. About 93% of them have a bachelor's degree. As far as the site-specific data, this is pretty classic weather data, right? In the Kenai, it's typically about 60 degrees come July. Sometimes it's kind of windy. On average, we have about 130 dip netters harvesting about 1,200 fish at Kasilof. We have about 700 dip netters on an average day harvesting about 10,000 fish on the Kenai. The average person's catching about 14 fish, which is how I know that we did well with our data exercise, because my harvest the last couple of years has been in the 20s, only fishing one tide. And then these are the fisheries I made my postdoc code, whether they were opened or closed. So these are all of our set net fisheries, and on the right-hand side are all of our drift net fisheries as well. And we went through, and the first thing we did was estimate the relationship between harvest and run size. Oh, that's frustrating. So it looks like this is maybe an older version of my slides, because these bullet points are supposed to be gone to make these equations easier to read. Basically, we just estimate the relationship between catch and run size, controlling for some potential confounders, particularly whether or not the commercial fisheries are open, as well as temperature and stuff that might discourage people from fishing or make it more difficult. If you've not been dip netting, if there's a lot of surf, it gets very difficult and most people just stop fishing. because of course, like you need to go far enough out that your net is in the water, but then you're getting kind of beat up by the waves. And we found some intuitive stuff. Basically, the relationship between log run size and catch is positive. If there's more fish in the water, people catch more. There is a negative relationship between set gillnet fishing, but there's no relationship that we observe between the drift gillnet fishery and success rates. This is also potentially confounded, so we're not 100% sure. Oh yeah, that's me with a bunch of silvers I caught. We're not 100% sure this trade-off is real, so we're still doing some robustness checks. But there's possibly a negative relationship between those set gill nets and the dipnet fishery. Intuitively, this maybe makes sense because part of what's happening, right, is that the fish are swimming to the shore and then swimming along the shore until they get to the mouth of the river. And so those set gill nets are set up along the shore before the fish get to the dip netters. So maybe they really are taking some fish out of the water, but we're not sure. And this again is us field testing the results. So when we looked and asked what leads to the highest catch, we followed our own prescriptions. We caught a bunch of fish. I believe maybe our data is pretty good. And then we went through, and this is the meat of the paper. We came up with what's called the travel cost model. So the intuition here is pretty cool, right? We don't really pay anything to go dip netting or personal use fishing. The permit's free once you have a recreational fishing permit. And so if we wanted to think about the value of the fishery just from like direct spend, maybe you can tease out the $120 at Costco to get your net, but you're not paying anything to participate in the fishery. And so this is where the argument of, hey, maybe it's worth nothing if people are spending nothing on it, gets scary, right? Because if it's not valued, then people will assume a value is zero. But what we do know is that households do spend a bunch of stuff. They do spend real money and real time to go fishing. They forgo their wages for the day if they're an hourly worker. They pay their time to drive down there, which is not recreation, right? Especially if you're sitting in traffic. They pay in the form of gasoline and wear and tear on their cars, right? They potentially pay a camping fee at the Kenai fishery. And so we see some of these costs, and we can tease out based on how these costs change for people, based on the distance of how close they live to the fishery, how their demand for fishing trips changes. So intuitively, we'd expect people from the Matsu to take fewer dip netting trips than people from the Kenai. And we'd expect people from Fairbanks, even though they're allowed to dip net fish at the Kenai, to fish less than people from Anchorage because they've got a longer travel time to get there and they face a larger implied cost. Now, if we can tease out this relationship between the price of fishing and the quantity of fishing that people do, we get a demand curve, and that lets us talk about the surplus to people from the fishing trips that they take. And so that's how we're going to get that number. And so we use something called a random utility model, in which we assume that people have a share of their well-being that comes from the stuff we can observe, like how many fish they catch, how many fish are in the water, whether it's a cold day or a warm day. And then there's some random stuff that we can't observe that we just assume is just like unpredictable for anybody. And we can come up with a utility function that explains whether or not people take trips. And so this is the economic theory behind it. This U is our total utility or my well-being from taking a trip. I assume that there's this part V I sub JT, which is specific to a place and a time and a fishery for a person or for a household, excuse me. And this includes the weather, the run size, my expected catch, all these different things. And then there's this E or this eta sub IJT, which is the random bit of like, maybe I just don't like fish. Or maybe I really love dip netting for some reason. I had a fun time as a kid and I have to go regardless of what the weather is. So that's all unobservable and it's kind of random. And from that, if we also assume that there's some level of utility I get from staying home, I can come up with a probability that the average person takes a trip on a given day, subject to all the stuff that's going on in the fishery. So down here on the bottom right, this is a really nice day to go fishing. It was really productive. I caught 20 fish in one tide. The weather was nice. There, you can see there's no waves, so I wasn't getting beaten up the whole time because there's no wind, right? I'm more likely to take a trip on this day relative to a day when it's storming and I've got to fight the waves and I'm not going to catch as much. I'm going to be cold and wet and tired and angry and everything else. And maybe there's no fish as well. And so we estimate this relationship using a couple different regression models. We do a version where we include both run size and average salmon catch. We do a version where we only include average salmon catch, and a version where we only use the run size, because we want to think about different ways that the value of a salmon may enter somebody's decision to make a choice. And we find two big things that make me think this regression is pretty good. The first one is the farther people live away from the fishery, the less likely they are to take a trip. The second one is the more fish that are in the water, the more likely they are to take a trip. And we see the same thing with catch. The more that they catch, the more likely they are to go fishing. Everything above this solid line, so income, education, age, family size, and salmon left, are related to how likely I am to stay home. So we see that higher income people are more likely to go fishing. People with a larger family are less likely to go fishing. As somebody who canceled my trip out to Dillingham and like 2 other talks in December because of my kids, the more kids you have, the less likely you are to be able to go do anything fun ever, from what I can tell. Not that I hold that against them. And the more fish you have left in your quota, the less likely you are to stay at home, right? Some other stuff, these coefficients on the different locations are all negative because most people stay home most of the time. And people do seem to fish less when the set gillnet fishery is out there and fish more when the drift gillnet fishery is out there. I didn't circle those as important things to talk about because what we think might be going on is that these things are confounded. That I'm fishing less when the set gillnet is out there because I'm also catching fewer fish, because maybe there's a trade-off between those two fisheries. And I'm fishing more when the drift gillnet fishery is out there because they're more likely to be open when the run size is really strong. So we're working on what's called identification to try and make sure that we're actually measuring what we think, which is why this is still a draft and the Department of the Interior does not agree with our results quite yet. But we can go through with some of our coefficients and through some use of that utility function, come up with estimates for the willingness to pay for a trip. Pretty robustly, we come up with about $425 per trip as a value of being able to participate in this fishery and having it be attractive enough for people to go personal use fishing. We find that the average person values an additional fish at something like $36 to $46. And again, if we include in the models where we include run size, people would pay between $2.87 to $8 for an additional 1,000 fish in the run on a given day. And people have various values for shutting down the entire commercial fishery operation for a day. We focus in my results in the very beginning on just the set net fishery because we don't have good evidence that shutting down gill netting does anything. So one of my to-dos in future research is to figure out if that trade-off actually exists, because there may just be against information. But one of the things we wanted to do was, since we're talking about management that includes both personal use and commercial fishing, is figuring out how can we compare the values we're coming up with for personal use fishing with the value of ex-vessel caught fish in the same year. And so we have ex-vessel fish data for 2021, which is where we're using our personal use fishing data from. That suggests a per pound price of $1.95. That $1.95 comes out to about $10 per fish. That $10 per fish is well below the personal use willingness to pay of $36 per fish. But we don't really believe that these are comparable values, right? So we also looked at the wholesale value, which a frozen fillet is worth about $25 wholesale. But we realized, hey, look, that's not what people are really buying here. Your personal use fisherman is going home and consuming these things, which is maybe closer to a retail fish. A retail fillet that year was going for $15 per pound, which comes up to almost $40 per fish. The cool thing is the 2024 retail value is roughly the exact same as the implied personal use value from our fishing, our data. So people are filling the freezer, they're buying food, potentially just to substitute for what they could otherwise buy in grocery stores. This is a minimum value for personal use fishing. So it would argue that, you know, those personal use fish are probably worth more than the retail value of those fish. But we can't say that for certain. The values kind of overlap. But this is cool. It suggests that ADF&G is managing the fishery pretty well. From our rough estimates, and this is still a draft, they're making the trade-off in the Upper Cook Inlet pretty well as of 2021. We went through and built a bioeconomic model to try and tease out some of these management decisions on the daily level. I've got two equations here. The first one here is just what we might think of as a profit function for harvesting commercially, right? So we've got on the left-hand side pi, that just means profit. On the right-hand side, this first term, the px multiplied by the stuff in the brackets, that's going to be our revenue to fishermen. This is a Schaefer harvest function. So we've got some effort that we use and a catchability coefficient that we try and calibrate to make sure that there's a reasonable return to the fishery that would motivate people to fish. Then we've got some cost coefficient for effort. I'm still figuring out how exactly to calibrate this, but the basic idea is fishermen need to bring in more revenue than the cost of their catch. And then we've also got from our personal use fishing model, our a random utility model, a measure of the consumer surplus or the well-being to a fisherman from taking a trip to go fishing. And so this assumes that if our model is well specified, this would be the consumer surplus to your average fisherman from taking a personal use fishing trip. And it's a function basically of run size or catch, and then all the other coefficients for how nice it is on that given day. But we just basically argue that the total well-being from the fishery, if we only care about personal use fishing and we only care about commercial fishing, is the sum of those two things, which means that there's a natural trade-off that any fish that's caught by commercial fishermen isn't available to our recreational fishermen, right? And so we should be making choices in how to allocate effort to try and maximize these two things together. And I deleted all the numbers from the axes on these things intentionally, because again, this is a draft and we don't quite know where the happy medium lands. But our model so far would suggest that basically a good manager should guarantee some minimum amount of fish is available to personal use fishermen, enough to induce people to take trips that are very valuable, not just for the total catch that's caught, but for the cultural aspects and the recreational aspects of the fishery as well. And then they should allocate surplus to commercial fishing or potentially recreational fishing as well. And as long as we reach some minimum size of stock available to personal use fishermen, above that, the total surplus actually declines, just because above that, the marginal willingness to pay for fishing declines because personal use fishermen are not efficient enough to catch everything that comes by. So my conclusions are that there's suggestive evidence that there's a trade-off between the set net, gillnet commercial fishery and personal use fishing. We're not 100% certain of that yet, so it's just suggestive. Both commercial and personal use fishing provide similar value to Alaskans. We're not including the value to out-of-state fishermen here at all. We're out except for the ones who are commercial fishermen. And that the allocation depends upon run size, but there's analytical support for a preference for personal use or subsistence fishing first, and then allowing the surplus to be caught by commercial fishermen. I would say there's a big question mark in some of our work here about how this deals with not knowing the run size before we allocate that catch. The timing in our fishery here requires the commercial fleet to operate before fish get to the personal use fishery and before they get to the sonar station after that. So we don't know run size, so we can't perfectly do the allocation yet. And we got to figure out how to handle that in the market in the future. But that's what I've got so far for you guys. I want to say thank you for spending your time hearing me talk about the value of fishing and the economics of fishing. And if I could end with a big disclaimer on this, maybe that should be in the title somewhere, right? These are minimum values for the value of personal use fishing. And these are minimum, these are lower bounds from our work so far. So we're not quite sure that we've nailed it yet, but we're still working on it. And so if anybody has questions or comments or anything else, it's early enough days that I'm going to take frantic notes and try and address them. If I don't have the answer now, before I send this anywhere or share it with larger groups. Let's grab a pen too.
Questions? I've got a question. I was fascinated by the distinction you draw between the impact of driftnet and gillnet fishery, or driftnet and setnet fisheries. And I had a couple of questions about how you're able to tease that out. First, when I think of those fisheries, I think of them based on Bristol Bay, mostly occurring, if one's open, the other is often open at the same time or close to the same time. And so I'm curious if that's the case in the fisheries you're looking at. And secondly, wondering about time lags and how do you account for that? So I'm imagining the driftnet fishery is farther from the personal use fishery, and so there's maybe more of a time lag there between when the fish would be caught by the drift netters as opposed to the set netters, and then when they're ultimately could be caught by the personal use fishery. I hope that.
Yeah. So my first pass at an answer to that question is Aaron Enrique has digitized all this, and he is the most intimately familiar with this data. So what I'm passing on is what he's told me secondhand, what I've seen, kind of messing around with the data and regressions post. I think they are very correlated. When the driftnet fishery is open, the setnet fishery is typically open as well. I think the setnet fishery is open a little bit more often. So we do have days where not both of them are open at the same time. But yeah, these things are potentially confounded. And so one of the things that we're thinking about moving to for future work is just lumping them together in is a nearby commercial fishery operating. and not trying to tease that out exactly. I have mixed feelings about that because I feel like there's interesting, if we can figure out a way to see a shock and see if there's a difference in how these two fisheries interact, like with the personal use fishing, I think there's a lot of policy like meat there to think about, but I don't know that we've nailed it yet. It's one of the reasons why I'm trying to get Aaron to digitize another 8 years of this data so we get more variation, that we can try and do something with that there, and maybe hope for a shock. I also want to go back and see if we can get more data from Fish and Game, because I think if we wanted to get at this exercise, one of the terrible things that's happening in Upper Cook Inlet, right, is that the commercial fishery is being impacted by the decline in run size for kings. And there's been policy changes in how you're allowed to fish in the set net fishery for sockeye because they're worried about bycatch of kings. And I think this last year they made the commercial fishery in some places move to dip nets, which are of course like less productive than a set gill net. And so I think there might be a neat experiment to look at that relationship as soon as we get the data from like this year, maybe next year too. But I don't know. I do think these things are definitely confounded because there's pretty high correlation when they're operating. And we haven't, I don't think we've nailed it yet.
Thanks.
Talking about that correlation between sockeye and king and catch, there's something similar in Bristol Bay about the king salmon management. And I was wondering if there's any research done on that for like comparing how much sockeye going through an X vessel value is lost in order to gain, and therefore correlate how much each king in the water is worth, or each king is in hand is worth.
So I haven't done anything like that, but I'm curious about the same question too, because there's quite a bit of room in like the economics literature for if you're watching a species potentially decline, if you're trying to save it, like how much should you be willing to forego for the chance that it recovers in the future? I haven't seen anybody do that kind of analysis with kings that like, I mean, some of the decline, if it is irreversible, which like my fisheries science colleagues, I'd be curious like what you guys have to say about that. From somebody who fishes for them, but also who's interested in the policy related to them, if they're going to come back, right? Like, because if kings are doomed, we should put less effort into trying to save them, is what the econ literature would suggest. Like if it's irreversible and we can't get them back, but if they could recover, and especially if they could recover quickly, like we should be willing to forego more sockeye to do it. And yeah, then like I don't know. I haven't seen anybody think specifically about the trade-off, like how many sockeye you have to forego catching to get to save an additional king salmon. I think the neat policy question I've been noodling too is potentially like if there's an endangered species listing or something for kings, and that removes some of the management of king salmon from ADF&G, like how exactly does that change ecosystem-based and adaptive management? Like if you take something away from a manager, right, that just changes their choice set, and it adds a whole other level of information and communication you need to do. And I don't know. I don't know how that goes.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions? Yeah.
Are there plans to extend this research into multi-years or different seasons? It sounded like you mentioned you're collecting data.
So I don't know if I heard the last bit there, but I think the question was, are there plans to extend it?
Correct, into multi-year to see trends over time, and also into different areas of Alaska.
So our first plan is to extend it to multi-years. Our first paper that we're going to do with this is the bioeconomic stuff I've shown today. We're also extending it to do a little bit of development of methods. So the diary data is unique in economics. Most questions where people are using travel cost methods, we don't have that detail of data. So that's the second paper we're working on. And then we have multiple years of data, but we just need to clean it up and get some of the like drift net stuff digitized. And so that's like the third thing I'm planning on doing. I've got a graduate student at the University of Wyoming who's expressed interest in cleaning the data for the drift, gillnet, and commercial set net fisheries. they haven't looked at it very closely, so I'm not sure what the timeline is for them to get it cleaned up. And I think they may be less excited when they see what exactly it looks like. But yeah, our hope is to do multiple years. And in particular, I'm curious what happens in 2019. So 2019, there was massive wildfires on the Kenai. If they came right up to the highway, just qualitatively fishing that year was worse because you were getting smoked out the whole time. And so I think there was interesting questions for non-fisheries reasons too, that would make it worthwhile to use multiple years of data.
Yeah, second question.
Yeah, my second question is, when you had said the value that the people would pay to close the commercial fishery, was that just for this region, for the Cook Inlet region?
Sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing because I think you might be kind of far from the mic.
I don't know where the mic is, but
It's up here.
oh, the value that you had at the very beginning of the slideshow that said how much people would be willing to pay to close the commercial fishery for personal use, is that specific to the Cook Inlet region?
Yes.
Okay. Are there plans to like expand the research to different areas and then maybe compare like that value to different regions?
I would, yeah. So in a dream world too, we'd also be able to extend this to like the Copper River fishery too.
Okay.
In order to do anything like Bristol Bay wise, we would need, I think, better data that I'm aware of existing. I would, an ideal data set, if it could exist, I would love to get for subsistence fishing, similar reports in travel distances and harvest and days fished and locations fished and stuff like that. And I would love to extend this research to include like the Bristol Bay fishery as well. I don't think that data exists. So some of this is a little bit like the drunk looking for their keys, right? Like we look where the light is, not where the keys are likely to be. And so that's why we focused on Upper Cook Inlet in this case, because there was this really clean data set we could jump on. But yeah, geographically, we could extend it to other personal use fisheries and then potentially recreational fishing. The problem with that though, too, is I'm more skeptical of the reporting with the recreational fishing data, just because I know too many people who don't report and don't respond to the surveys. The neat thing about the personal use stuff is that it's relatively well enforced, because the troopers can sit right at the entry to the fishery and just pull you over and ask you to open your cooler. But yeah, I have seen other people attempt it too. The zonal model I mentioned in the beginning tried to extend it to include, I think they did recreational fishing and personal use fishing, including copper. But by doing the recreational stuff too, to combine data sets, they had to lose a lot of the geographic like resolution.
Any other questions?
Can I have one that's not about this talk, if everyone's done?
For Kevin?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is a tariff?
Told you it was coming.
I've been getting asked that a lot lately. Actually, we were saying that people might be interested in that before the talk. So a tariff is a tax paid by an importer on a good that's produced overseas. So it's a tax on consumers. It's like a sales tax. The tariffs that are proposed right now are 10% on China. I think they're ramping it up to 20% for reasons, and then 25% on everything imported from Canada as well as Mexico too. And so if we're thinking about Alaska specific stuff, that is your vegetables, your fruits, your aluminum that goes to make boats, some of the material used for like big manufacturing processes on the North Slope. If we were talking about building a big pipeline, it's potentially the steel that would have been used for that as well. It's everything. And so tariffs can hit us directly. Like I would expect the price of, the price of like strawberries could go up by a max like 25% in the next, I don't know, today, tomorrow. It might go up by less depending on how much of that final consumer price is based on the cost of bringing the strawberry to the United States. But then it can also show up in like lost job opportunities and higher costs of operating for firms. Right. So every fisherman now who's going to need to buy material from Canada is going to have to pay 25% more for it, which means their cost is going to go up, and they got to either pass that on to processors if they can, or it's going to come out of their profit. And that's going to be a challenge.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have other thoughts on tariffs too. Typically, we use tariffs to try and the arguments are that we're going to protect jobs or other countries are being unfair. The last time we imposed tariffs in 2018, we did it on there was a great experiment where we did it on washing machines. The average job that we created with those tariffs cost $800,000. They didn't pay $800,000. They cost consumers $800,000. Most of that additional money disappeared. So tariffs make markets less efficient overall, and they work by raising costs for consumers. A tariff protects jobs by making the products you buy more expensive. There's also a national defense argument that's used a lot. That makes a lot of sense for goods that are directly related to national defense, where manufacturing them matters a lot. So like microchips and stuff are used in things like drones. And drones are how people fight modern wars. And so you want like a domestic drone manufacturing industry to help fight wars. They're also used in like everything else, like fighter jets, tanks, bombs, whatever, all use microchips. I can't come up with a good national defense reason for imposing a tariff on avocado. I've been trying for the last week because I keep getting asked about tariffs, and I wanted to figure out where there's the national defense aspect to avocados. We also don't grow them in the United States, so that also doesn't make sense. There's no jobs to be protected there. And so the last motivation often used for tariffs is that they're a political bargaining chip. I have less to say as an economist about that, except if you were bargaining with somebody and you make the same threat over and over and over, eventually they're not going to believe you, or they're going to want to stop giving you new things just not to do the thing you keep threatening to do, and you eventually lose that bargaining power. And so I think like it's outside like the direct economic consequences. There's some neat strategic behavior questions there. But I would say there's a trade-off that anybody using tariffs as a bargaining chip needs to think about, which is, am I burning all of my negotiating power for something that's worthwhile or not? I don't know if we're doing that.
So at the end of the day, like the bottom line, when there's a tariff imposed on things like fruits and veggies, who benefits from this?
So if it's something that we can grow domestically, domestic producers will benefit a little bit. The government will raise revenue with it, and that's good. Consumers will lose, no matter what, unless you really care about what country your strawberries come from, in which case you still, I don't think, would benefit, because you can buy your strawberries from the United States if we produce them already and pay a premium. But yeah, there's a lot of tariffs there's basically three types of tariffs. There's win-win tariffs. You might think of this as like a border adjustment if we're trying to fight like an externality like climate change, like if we're trying to reduce carbon emissions and we want to make sure everybody has universally like the same rules, right? Where like that external thing outside of the tariff itself has to be worth a lot. There's win-lose tariffs, right? Like the washing machine example that I talked about a few minutes ago, right? There was a clear winner there, and that it was the domestic washing machine industry. And there was losers, which was consumers and anybody who trying to sell washing machines in the United States. And then there's lose-lose tariffs, like if you impose a tariff on avocados, which we don't grow in the United States. So avocados become more expensive for us, and the people who sold us avocados can't sell us as many avocados anymore, and everybody just kind of loses. The lose-lose and the win-lose tariffs are much more common than the win-win ones. And in general, the winners from tariffs the gains from tariffs are typically much smaller than the costs of them.